Record to the cloud. Oh, okay. How does one make a person a co-host? Oh, probably click here. We're gonna clip this part out.
Of course. All
Okay,
right.
amazing.
I'll let you take it away. First, let me just welcome everyone to our workshop for the DEI Advisory Council. We are so excited to have Dr. Klug today joining us to talk about compassionate leadership. I'd like to introduce Evan Lockhart, our outreach manager, to offer some brief words and also introduction to our guest speaker for today. Evan?
Amazing. So thank you, Deirdre. So today we are going to do a webinar on leading with compassionate action with Dr. Renee Bhatti-Klug. Dr. Bhatti-Klug is the founder and chief facilitator for Cultural and Intelligent Training and Consulting, a Phoenix-based diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging consultancy. As an educator, speaker, and writer, Renee focuses on the topics of developing cultural intelligence, building people-centered curricula, and fostering cultures of belonging. For over 20 years, she has been educating students and training leaders from over 150 nations. Using a model she and the CITC team developed and tested through their work with corporations, universities, nonprofits, and startups. As a leader, she seeks to model the values of curiosity, empathy, and compassion, all through action-oriented and data-driven decision-making. Renee is a first-generation Punjabi American and Enneagram enthusiast.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Evan and Deirdre. It's so great to be here. Hi, everyone. I want to invite you today to use the chat if you want to highlight something, bolster something. Even though it's a webinar, I'm going to try to integrate all of whoever's here, your information, because I am not the only one here with knowledge. And I'm also going to be inviting you, but certainly not requiring you to participate in several polls, because I think that that's good to kind of, get our brains working and engage with the content. So we will, however, be saving Q&A until the end, but Evan has agreed to capture any of those questions in case I miss them. So I want to first make a land acknowledgement, and if you want to share the land that you are currently gathered upon, you can do so in the chat, but I want to acknowledge the Native nations that have inhabited lands across North America for centuries. These comprise the ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. In Phoenix, Arizona, where I currently am, these include the Akimel-Otham, Peepash, and Hohokam Native communities. And to find out which Native land you're on, you can go to native-land.ca. So, oh, look at this. I love this in the chat. I see the College for Creative Studies respectfully acknowledges that we are on the traditional, contemporary, and ancestral homelands of the, can you help me, Evan, and finish the rest?
Yes.
Deirdre, go ahead.
Go ahead. Ojibwa, we have the Ottawa and the Potawatomi. Along with their neighbors of the Seneca, Delaware, Fox, Shawnee, Loops, Miami, and Wyandotte, who maintain and continue to preserve lifeways along the Detroit River banks and throughout the Great Lakes region. Through the signing of the Treaty of 1807, the Ashbek tribe ceded the land now occupied by the city we stand on. We recognize Michigan as home of 12 federally recognized tribal communities, and they continue to maintain for future generations.
Thank you so much for that compassionate action. I did not want to mispronounce anything, and I know that I would have, so thank you, Deirdre. So today we're going to talk about understanding compassion via cultural intelligence. I'm not going to go deep down into cultural intelligence, but give you a high overview, because to really engage compassion, we need to understand some elements of our cultural intelligence model. And then I'm going to walk you through some scenario-based understanding of demonstrating compassionate action using some research-based tools. And then I'll invite you to participate via Q&A. So in understanding compassion, the first thing that I would love for you to do, and you can access the chat, the poll here, is in one word or a short phrase, describe compassion. Somebody's already said understanding people's feelings and taking them into account when making decisions, always embodying kindness and empathy, caring for others. Somebody else is the act of leading with love and understanding. Take about 30 more seconds. Again, you do not have to share. Ability to relate to another, kindness. Love and understanding to oneself and others. And we'll do one more. If there's one more, I'll give it a few seconds. Great. Thank you so much. I agree with all of these, and we'll go into a deep dive of what compassion is. In taking a look, though, first of recognizing what we mean by culture. So many people have so many different ideas, and most of those ideas about culture are actually accurate. But as we factor in what cultural intelligence is and what compassion means and why we need to demonstrate it, culture, of course, are the beliefs and customs and arts of a particular society, group, place, or time. That's the dictionary definition. And culture comes from the Latin root word cultus and French colere, which means to tend to the earth, to nurture, to grow, hence an image here of a person cultivating a garden. But I want to remind you that as we engage culture, it is a lot of the artistries and beliefs and customs, but it comprises the social and cultural identities of people across abilities, whether those are seen or unseen, our education levels, especially as we're situated at colleges or higher education institutions. There can be so much power dynamics and exclusion based on people's perception of education or levels of education or degrees, all of these things, our ethnicities, our families, who reared us, how they reared us, our gender identities, our generations, when we were born, geography, where we are. I'm going to relate to the world differently being in Phoenix than you might be if you're in Michigan right now. Language, nationality, the countries to which we have citizenship, our politics and religions, should we choose to engage those, our sexual orientations, socioeconomics, and workplace, how we show up in the workplace. So I want you to remember these social and cultural identities as we move throughout today's webinar. So then cultural intelligence is our ability to understand how we feel, think, and act as we are engaging across cultural settings and multicultural situations with people from diverse social and cultural identities. Our model, very quickly, is thus. As we engage emotional intelligence, which is our ability to recognize how we're feeling and also how other people are feeling, and we use this to determine what we think and then how we're going to act. Research says that most often we engage emotional intelligence with people who have similar cultural and social identities as we do, factoring in intersectionality, right? We're never just any one thing, but as we kind of, relate to people and have that kind of affinity, it's more emotional intelligence that we are primarily engaging. As we move outside of our primary social and cultural identities, we then want to engage cultural intelligence, where we might have to shift our behaviors. If I'm engaging outside of my age demographic, especially Evan mentioned that I'm Punjabi American. If I'm engaging with Punjabi males from India who are older than I am, I might shift my behaviors accordingly. That's cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence is rooted in cultural openness, the how we feel. This is our willingness to learn about ourselves and others. It's grounded in the value of curiosity. Then we move to cultural awareness, and this is how we think. This is the active process of learning not just about others, but also about ourselves. It's guided and rooted in the value of empathy, and I'm going to talk about that today because empathy is a tool of our next capability, which is cultural responsiveness. This is how we demonstrate inclusive action based on what we learned through cultural awareness. Empathy is a tool of compassion, and compassion is what guides cultural responsiveness. And I'm going to unpack empathy and compassion so we really understand compassionate action. All right. So in one word, I'm missing a slide. I knew it was going to do this. Poll everywhere sometimes. So I want to poll everywhere is being naughty today. And Evan, you know what? We are in solidarity today. Evan had some computer problems and now my computer is not functioning properly. So I'm going to stay here while I define empathy using a definition by Wiseman. And Wiseman says that empathy is comprised of 4 different skills. The first is one's ability to see the world as others do. The second is to understand others' feelings. So listen, empathy is not necessarily feeling what someone else feels. That is empathy. It's one aspect. It's emotional or affective empathy. But empathy is also cognitive, where you can just understand without necessarily having to feel it. I'll talk about that later on. Our ability to remain non-judgmental. You might not understand why somebody might be sad because that thing's not sad to you, but can you remain non-judgmental in allowing them to feel that sadness? And finally, our ability to communicate an understanding of that person's viewpoint or needs. So those are the 4, and I'm going to walk you through those in a poll. Again, I invite those of you who are live to tap into how you're feeling in one word, and just use one word because this is going to create a cloud. Describe how you have felt when others have expressed empathy or cultural awareness toward you or your work. So now they're expressing, they are asking you questions. They're trying to figure out how you're feeling or thinking about something. And you can be honest. It may not be a positive emotion, and that's okay. I see included, valued. Take about 10 more seconds. Affirmed, confident, supported, valued again, yes. Heard. Great. And sometimes I also hear suspicious, because if we're not demonstrating empathy in a way that feels genuine, or we haven't built relationship, that can really create a barrier there to exhibiting true empathy. Thank you for your participation. So next, I want to do a quick empathy quiz. These are anonymous, and you can stay in the same poll everywhere throughout this entire presentation. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree, I would love to see how you would rate yourself in your demonstration of the 4 qualities that Wiseman described as comprising empathy. So first, I am able to see the world as others do. Take about 10, 15 seconds. Again, you don't have to do this. It's entirely up to you. Great. A few more seconds. So we have a tie here, 4 and 5. Most of you do believe that you are able to see the world as others do. Several of you admitted that you don't, and that's okay. If you choose to see the world as others do, think about how you might do that, how you might listen better, how you might create opportunities for engaging people who are different than you, so you can understand their perspectives. This doesn't always come naturally to everybody, and it is a learned skill. Second, I am able to understand others' feelings. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I'm not judging you based on that. I can't even see who's doing what. So maybe, the
Yeah, I
if you
picked one on accident. I got confused.
so we have a higher demographic of those who strongly agree. So good. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So are you
what I
able
meant
to
to say.
understand others' feelings, not necessarily feel them? Good. So here's about 60% of you strongly agree. That's changing a little bit, but most of you believe that you can agree. Some of you are neutral on there. Again, our personalities can come into this. If we have neurodiversity, there are so many, if we're having a bad day, sometimes it's not easy for us to understand somebody else's perspective. Again, all of this factors in to how we're able to demonstrate compassion ultimately. I am able to remain non-judgmental of others. And again, sometimes the judgment might come up and then you're able to say, oh, no. Let's quiet that real quick. The majority here say 3, they're neutral. And listen, that's kind of how this one rolls, but it's good for us to understand there's still 29% of you strongly agree that you can remain non-judgmental, but how might you move out of immediately running to judgment? We're actually going to talk about that today because it's all part. Empathy and compassion are uniquely linked. Finally, I am able to communicate an understanding of another person's viewpoint or needs. Y'all, I may have gotten ahead of me. Okay, here we go. So the majority of you say, yes, you agree that you can. And a few of you are neutral on that, which again is okay. This takes practice and we'll talk about it today. And you're not going to work with me, are you? You are not going to work with me. Yep, you're not going to work with me. So I'm going to now define the greater good science center at UC Berkeley. We're not doing a poll right now. My slides are, being finicky because we're on a webinar and, the slides want to be finicky. But in defining compassion, again, the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley says that while empathy refers more generally to our ability to take the perspective of and feel the emotions or think or understand the emotions of another person, compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. So I like to define compassion as empathy in action. It's when somebody has learned about your need, and through compassionate action, they do something to alleviate your burden. So let's tap into cultural intelligence, how you feel. In one word, describe how you have felt when others have expressed compassion or cultural responsiveness toward you or your work. So now they know your need and they're doing something about it within their power. How has that made you feel? Relieved, appreciative, grateful. Maybe about 10 more seconds. Yeah. Relieved, I already said that, thankful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And this, really tapping into how have you felt about it, going into that cultural intelligence and and I actually believe we go beyond the golden rule to the platinum. The golden rule says, treat others how we would like to be treated, but the platinum, treat others how they would like to be treated. But sometimes it's important to understand how we feel about something so we can move in to looking through the lens of others via empathy. And now compassion. I see happy as well. Thank you. All right, slides. Okay, here we go. So my slides are back on track. So looking into some research, Sapala has an article in which she says that compassion, and I added there empathy since I have control over my slides, and curiosity increase employee loyalty and trust. There's been so many surveys that have emerged since 2020 that have really looked at the attrition rates because of the great resignation that has occurred, in which over 4% of the US population has left their jobs. Of that population, they've primarily been Black women who have identified as mothers who have really left. And they've tapped into that in some research, and this is through catalyst.org, asking why they've left. And oftentimes it's because employees left because they did not feel that their employers could demonstrate high levels of empathy and compassion. And so when we are able, because empathy and compassion go hand in hand, which is why this is where I start. The empathy is that learning, and the compassion is the doing. And compassion does go beyond sympathy and empathy. We have this graphic here from Haggard et al. That takes a look at the differences. People ask me this all the time. Well, what's pity and sympathy? And I love this. To the left of this kind of scale, pity is somebody saying, I feel sorry for you. Oh, poor you. It's not often based in a response in which it makes somebody feel seen or heard. All right. Usually people end up feeling worse when you show pity. Sympathy is the next step, though. People don't necessarily feel worse here, but it's I feel for you. It's that I'm sorry. Empathy now is feeling with someone. You don't necessarily have to have experienced what that somebody has experienced. Maybe that person has lost a parent and you still have both of your parents living, but you can still feel with them, getting into their shoes in a way that maybe you haven't yet experienced. That's that empathy, of course, with those 4 attributes that Wiseman described. And then finally, that compassion. I'm here to help. I've learned your need. I'm here to help. All right. And really, we're coming into that spectrum of understanding another's experience. All right. And compassion and empathy have both been called a soft skill. And I want to negate that right now via that research study that I just cited, that without empathy and compassion, leaders really are not leading well. And we're finding that in attrition rates, whether it is with faculty and staff or whether it's with student enrollment. Whether we have US-born students who are representing dominant cultural identities or culturally and linguistically diverse students, including international students. They are not necessarily going to want to be part of our institutions if they're not going to feel a sense of inclusion and belonging. Ruchika Tulshyan, who's the author of Inclusion on Purpose, has a little bit of global awareness where a lot of, if we're situated in the US as we are, a lot of people do want to feel a sense of inclusion. If we are not outside of the US and from cultures in which there is a more collectivism or interdependence, the idea of belonging resonates so much more with those students and individuals versus the idea of inclusion, because inclusion really taps into representation, where we're taking a diverse group of people, we're bringing them together, and we want them to feel uniquely seen and heard based on all of the different identities and ideas that they have. With students from interdependent or collectivistic cultures, of course, they are unique to one another, but they really do have a lot of shared value systems. So now, can I feel a sense of belonging in this community, whether it is one that is that they've had throughout their lives or one that's new. So that's just some language there, because compassion has to do with all of these things. So let's take a look at how we do this. I'm going to set this up with a scenario, and I want to ask you what went wrong and walk you through this. So we have Bree here on the left, she, her, and we have Chris, he, him on the right. And here's the story. Chris is a new work study. Bree is his supervisor. Bree has had extensive experience in handling student-facing issues. However, Chris has limited professional experience in general. And although he has a great deal of academic knowledge, and he's done very well in school, Chris is also a curious and open-minded person who is willing to learn. While Bree is overseeing a call that Chris is having with a student, Chris makes a faux pas while speaking. Bree immediately takes over the conversation, interrupting Chris. After the call, Bree tells Chris she's not sure he's cut out for this job, but she hopes he can pay attention and learn much faster in the future. Chris is not entirely sure what he did wrong and feels demoralized and even unsure about his potential at this job and the college. He begins looking for other work-study opportunities. So we see here, we've got, a lot of tension going on with a lot of missing pieces. And so let's unpack this. Bree had a reflexive response. Something went wrong. She, of course, is in authority. She has more experience, but her immediate reflexive response was to interrupt, to take over, to scold even, and to take control. And it's not a compassionate reaction at all. And I say reaction versus response. Chris then has the resulting response. And of course, the response here is going to be different based on the person. But by and large, Chris's response could be shared by many people. And it's disengagement and possible attrition. Where he's like, listen, if this is how it's going to be here, and we don't know how much the levels of training are. Did Bree put Chris on a cold call? We don't have a lot of that information, but I sure hope that there was some scaffolding that happened. Trying to tuck in these nuggets as we go to remind you, whether it's a work study or somebody who's a veteran in the field. So how could Bree have operated differently in order to demonstrate compassionate action? This all now is rooted in Sapala's research. And so the first skill that Sapala mentions is understanding and regulating emotions through increasing emotional intelligence. And that's why I started where I did with that empathy, is so often we don't understand ourselves. And I'm so thankful in the last 5-10 years that people are really tapping into mental and emotional health. You all mentioned, Deirdre, you mentioned that your children are having mental health days, which I absolutely love. And I celebrate that through their school. Yes. Yes. And it's so amazing that that's happening. Socrates said, know thyself. And when we apply emotional intelligence, we can own our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and thus increase not just emotional, but also cultural intelligences. So how do we do this? This is a competency. Often, our initial responses are armored. Why? Because of our past trauma. Because we're at work and we need to do our thing. We need to, if we're efficiency driven, I'm tapping into how Bree responded now. And maybe we respond because we're like, well, I know how to do this. Maybe Bree is not very self-aware and feels like not everybody, but that Chris should be doing things the way that Bree does them, and doesn't allow Chris space to do things the way that he should do it. Now, Chris did do a faux pas, and we don't know what that faux pas was. It could have been serious, like a microaggression, in which case Bree didn't address the microaggression. It could have been a sexist or ageist comment. It could have been an assumption about culture. It's all of these things. The faux pas could have been that Chris is newer to the college and the details weren't exactly right. And this have to tap into training. Did Bree provide enough training? Or again, did they do just something differently than Bree would have? So then Bree's competency levels in increasing emotional intelligence is pausing when she had that immediate gut reaction. Oh my gosh, Chris did something wrong. So Bree now would benefit from doing the work of determining what emotions have come up in her. Oh my gosh, embarrassment. Could be shame. It could be anger. It could be, now this is tapping into Bree's personality. What emotions are coming up? And before she immediately goes straight into action, action should be the third response. Feelings, then thinking, then action. This sounds familiar. I talked to you about this during that the cultural intelligence model. So after Bree ascertains, and this can happen quickly, as we practice these skills, they become more instinctive. They take a while at first. Sometimes it requires therapy, a lot of hard conversations, apologies. So she feels what she's feeling. Then she thinks, okay, is this response triggered by what Chris did or by something else like shame, like embarrassment, like whatever? And what can I do to yield the best outcome? Best could be a lot of things here. It could be making sure that the student is served, making sure that Chris learns, but in a safe way. You know, Bree's got to think about this quickly, but she doesn't have to respond right away. She could take 10 seconds. She also needs to think about the consequences of her behavior, right? Is there even internalized bias? Chris is young. Chris is a person of color, as we saw in the image. Chris has a different gender than Bree does. Chris may or may not have a disability. There could be a lot of things going on. Does Bree have any internalized biases against Chris that she doesn't even realize? Right? Maybe she doesn't, maybe he's younger than she is. All of these things could come to play. We don't know, but it would behoove Bree to think about these things. All of us, it actually would. And as these things come up, recognize how we're feeling and thinking before we move into action. The second skill is applying our empathy to interactions, especially while we're listening and speaking. So Bree now has ascertained how she's feeling, and she's thought about how she might behave. Now, how can she tap into empathy? Now, Chris is on a call, so this might be a little tricky, but maybe she could be listening to learn rather than to act. Listening to learn rather to act. What's going on with the other person? Maybe a question came up, I mentioned this earlier, that the student had that Chris has not been trained on. Ooh, so Bree realizes, Bree hears this, okay, if she's not jumping straight to reaction, thinking, ooh, okay, there's a question there that Chris may not know the answer to. Maybe she sees this faux pas happen and she's like, okay, woof. Maybe she says, how would I have behaved if I was in their shoes? Maybe Chris was triggered, and Bree realizes that by whatever the situation is, whether it was a delicate or an egregious trigger, and Chris responded because he got nervous. Maybe Bree could think, all right, is there something that I could do to mitigate this thing and not just jump straight on the call? There are so many things that Bree could do to learn before she reacts. Now, of course, if she decided to wait until Chris got off the call so she doesn't interrupt, but Chris gets off the call, there's a lot of learning she could do there. All right. And that moves into compassionate skill 3, which is first demonstrating our willingness to help after developing that awareness. This is really tapping into that cultural intelligence, or CI. So it's really moving into that question, how can I support you? Especially because in this power dynamic, Bree is Chris's supervisor. Her sole role is to support Chris, in my opinion. It may not be in her opinion. And the social skill of compassion is based almost entirely on communication. we're able to we can also be assertive and compassionate at the same time, meaning we can demonstrate self-love that really taps into understanding how we're feeling and how we're thinking, and a love for others. Really tapping into the idea of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And this is a kind of a term that came out of several African countries. Desmond Tutu used it a lot in his frameworks. Also can be defined as I care about me. And that means that I also care about you. In Logek, which is an indigenous language, there's a saying, you are my other me. If we choose to be compassionate people, we want to embody this idea of Ubuntu, of understanding that I am because you are because I am, and we have this symbiotic relationship. And so as Bree engages Chris, she can really see him as a human, as a work study, as somebody new. And her responses can be so much different because of that. Bree can even engage a deeper amount of empathy and understanding her feelings. I actually had to do this last week. Something critical and dire came up, and I had to make a very quick decision in how I was going to respond. And I did not have a framework for knowing how to respond to this situation because it was new for me. So I did something called box breathing. It's when you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold that breath for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, and then you do that 4 times. So it's kind of like a box. And I think like special forces, special ops in the military do that when they're in high stress situations. And I did that because I was like, I have to think about what my response is going to be to a highly emotionally charged situation in which I did feel lost, but I was an authority and I had to do something. That I was so full of the chaos of my own emotions that I couldn't even understand my emotions because I couldn't access them yet. So I did this breathing technique so I could clear like the air within me and quiet everything else so I could access that emotion. And I was able to access it, pause, recognize, is this emotion real? Is it telling me a story that's true? Does this emotion belong to me, or am I projecting onto somebody else? And then I was able to move into thinking, what do I want to do? How am I going to respond? What's the first call I'm going to make? There was a behavior that was done and there needed to be a consequence. I needed to say, what is the fair consequence to this behavior that's aligned with the behavior and not just some rando consequence? Is there a policy in place for this? I hope there was. There was a policy in place. And I was able to go back to the policy. I had to think about it though. After I sorted through my emotions, what's in place here that will help me scaffold my decision? And then I was able to sit down with this person and have a compassionate driven conversation that was rooted in what this person already knew because I had prepared them, that was addressing the actual issue at hand, and that was able to implement consequences that they understood. Okay, this is fair. This is fair. And we were able to move forward, not in shame, but in resolution and grace. And I felt really, really proud about that. Third thing here, boundaries. Boundaries are an act of compassion. There are some instances where we have to say no. And we have to integrate choices where we say, you know what, in this situation where I had to sit this person down, I said, you know what, I could let this thing go. But this thing has come up already several times in our interactions. And now I need to put forth the consequence. Why? Because if I don't, I'm going to continue to enable you instead of empowering you. I truly begin, that was last week, now we've got about 5 or 6 days between us. I truly feel that this person has felt empowered to be better, to do better, based on the boundary that I put up to really enact a consequence. And so when we're saying, okay, should I say yes to this or no to this? Ask, will it enable or empower? And let that guide. And look, let's say you are a faculty member and you have decided to kind of loosen up your late work policy. All right, that's a compassionate response. But now let's say all of these assignments are coming in the last week of class and you're like, I can't do this and get my grades in time. So now next semester, you might have to dial back that, that loose kind of boundary and say, hey, look, I'll loosen my late work policy, but now you've got 2 weeks and not the entirety of the semester. And if it's related to an assignment that maybe, I was an English professor for 17 years prior to moving into DEI work about 10 years ago. And for me, I had my students build on an outline and then a draft and then a pre-draft and then their final draft. And so if I didn't get their outline until way late in the semester, it kind of messed the whole cycle and the series, and they didn't really learn the skill of editing a rough draft, a dirty rough draft, right? A terrible rough draft. So I needed to set firm yet compassionate boundaries around that. This also plays into how we conduct interactions during class. Are we allowing our empathy for our students, whether this is in class or in a meeting, to guide our compassionate responses, whether it's in how we're engaging discussion? Am I allowing people to maybe write out their ideas if they're internal processors? Am I allowing them to chat with each other if they're verbal processors before risking sharing their ideas out loud in a group discussion? If I'm a staff or a faculty member and I'm in a meeting, have I sent out a meeting agenda 24 hours in advance? Have I invited different people to contribute? During the meeting, am I not just allowing these external processors or extroverted types to share their ideas? Have I allowed maybe through a Google form or email correspondence afterwards? Hey, those of you who weren't able to contribute to the meeting, what do you think? Or let's leave this conversation open up for a couple of days, because how many of us after we left the meeting were like, oh, I forgot to share this, or now I know what I wanted to say. Compassionate leaders give space for these kinds of things. Compassionate faculty integrate representative texts into assignments, so students can feel seen and heard. So let's go back to Bree and Chris and see how Bree could have done things different. When Chris made the faux pas, now Bree waited until the phone call ended instead of jumping right on. And she spoke to Chris through compassionate dialogue. She asked, how do you think that went? Now, Chris may have already caught his mistake. And in this case, Bree may say it happens. And she might suggest a follow-up strategy. She might even say, you know what, I neglected to teach you that. Here's where that is. And maybe they follow up together with the student and answer that student, or if they need to own a behavior, maybe if it was an egregious faux pas, maybe Chris can handle that. Maybe Chris handled it right away. Maybe if Bree hadn't interrupted, Chris would have said, you know what, I apologize for saying what I did. Maybe they misgendered the person, maybe whatever they did. All right. If she sees that Chris is emotionally troubled, she might suggest that he takes a few minutes. I know that was a hard conversation. Do you need a minute? She could also ask him what he needs. He may not know in the moment if he's emotionally troubled, but maybe once he calms down, she's able to ask. Later, if it's appropriate, and it's not always appropriate, She might even be able to share a story from her early days. If Chris really feels distraught, like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Maybe out of vulnerability and transparency, she says, you know what? When I was work study 20 years ago, I did this. And here's what the resulting outcome was. And here's what I learned. And Chris can be, oh, okay, cool. You know, Bree's amazing. And I want to be like her one day. And I'm so glad that she's had these experiences too. And she got over that. Now, if Chris doesn't realize what he's done, Bree could offer advice. She could say, you know, I noticed that you said this during the call. And in my experience, having been here 20 years, that statement could have had this impact on a student. She might be able to walk him through impact versus intention. I know, Chris, that you mean well, you're amazing, but you're saying this could have had that impact. And I just want to let you know that. So in coaching, instead of doing something for the person, again, that boundary and empowering. And also not catastrophizing, saying, oh, you know, you did this or you did that, or jumping in and really just blowing it up and making it so much worse than it could be. You know, it seems like things went okay. You handled it all right. And we've all had these moments, but how can I support you more in understanding your role and understanding your role as work study? What's some more tools that I can give you to better assist you in feeling empowered next call you're on? So going back and revising, huge demonstration of compassion. Yeah. And again, if you have questions, we'll get to them at the end. You're welcome to share them in the chat or send them to Evan directly if you'd like to have them remain anonymous. So as a reminder, as we wrap up here, engaging compassion is considering the why behind your feelings, even behind other people's feelings, if you're aware of their feelings. It's taking the other's perspective through that empathetic lens. And it's applying culturally responsive solutions. It's ascertaining, where's my responsibility here? Is there something I could have done differently prior to this happening? If it's a microaggression done publicly, whether in class or in a meeting, you as the leader, if you're the authority here, do you address it right away? Right? Some of us are different. If it's a microaggression that happens in public, maybe we address it in public and then also have a follow-up. How do we become more aware? What tools? If let's say, Chris, this isn't the first time a work study has made this error. We realize, oh, this is now an issue where there's something not being clearly communicated with several work studies. So now we need to go back and train people better. And this is on me as the supervisor to say, okay, what tools do I need to put into place? How can I have printed materials, electronic materials? How can I slow this down and provide more professional development? These are culturally responsive solutions. All right, I want to poll you again. I would love for you to rank your compassionate action skill levels in the order of most to least competent. So you can slide these. Do you feel like you are best at understanding your feelings, at taking the other's perspective, or at applying culturally responsive solutions? You can rank them 1, 2, 3. Let me make sure that it's up. Yeah. And if you do need to get back onto the poll everywhere, I can share it again in the chat. I see you coming on in. Take about 10 or 15 seconds to do this. All right. So I see that it's in the order that that these skills go, which is actually really, really encouraging to see that you are understanding your feelings, taking the other's perspective, and applying culturally responsive solutions. So this is good. And with the culturally responsive solutions, a lot of that is a framework. Having those tools, understanding those tools, moving forward in training. And so how can you as a team learn some more of those skills? Always happy to help there. So great, thank you. So in closing out, what is the first behavior that you want to model to demonstrate compassionate action? Share this as a word or a sentence. I'll give you about 30 seconds. Taking a moment to consider my response. So good. Listening. Understanding the other point of view. Taking a breath before acting, also listening to listen and not to respond. Here. I cannot tell you, especially as leaders or as faculty, immediately we want to just serve. We want to just help, but sometimes we help so much more or more effectively when we just take a beat to learn. Okay, they may not actually need my help. They may just need me to listen to them. They may need to process their idea. That's it. Pausing before engaging. Yes, and connected to this. Sometimes I've been asking, do you want me to listen just to listen? Or would you like me to listen to provide feedback? And some people are like, oh, I don't know, because we haven't practiced knowing how we want to be listened to. But it's such a great question. And if we can start creating a culture, people can start becoming more aware themselves, where we impart that empathy and compassion to say, hey, how do you want to be listened to? It's amazing. Pausing before engaging. Here again. Yes. Thank you. Again, if you have questions, you can start sharing those. So I want to practice with you this boxed breathing, right? And I'll walk you through this. So you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out for 4 seconds, and we'll do it 4 times. Okay, here we go. Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Breathe out for 4. And we'll do it quietly now 3 more times. Right. Helps, right? It helps. I think it helps. And I'm not usually one to, sometimes my brain goes 100 different directions when I try to meditate, but I found that this is good. It can be quick and it can be done in a way that is quiet before we move forward. And you don't have to breathe loudly like I did. I did that so we could pace ourselves. You can do it quietly. So I want to say thank you so much for your time, your attention, your participation. And I want to invite you now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen to participate in Q&A. So let me stop. And Evan, would you mind, if there are any questions, you can go ahead and share.
Yes, I have a question from Amy. Amy asks, how do you respond with compassion and not judgment when someone expresses a viewpoint you fundamentally disagree with? E.g., saying that everyone does not have the right to running water and condoning water shutoffs in Detroit.
Yeah, I know. A response kicked up in me just in reading that example that you gave. Thank you, Amy. So, Amy, what I try to do, and it's not always easy, especially at Thanksgiving. You know, if we've had some wine or whatever, and we're trying to relax, and all of a sudden there's an uncle or an aunt or a brother or a sister or whatever who says something, and you're like, you know, I haven't always been the best at this, but I'm learning to say, well, why do you think that? And what that allows me is I have that gut reaction. And then it allows me to calm my own emotions down, but it also gives that other person a chance to explain. And then it allows me to move out of judgment and into understanding. And it allows me also to collect myself and perhaps a counter argument. And look, if we're at Thanksgiving, or even if we're in a meeting, usually I say, can I present a counter argument? And the person might say yes or no. It may not be appropriate time, but then that person sees that I'm willing to listen to their perspective. And when I'm willing to listen to others' perspective, the likelihood of their being able to listen to mine increases. It's not 100%, but it increases. And I've learned that this is great in addressing microaggressions as well. You know, an example, oh, you're really smart for a woman. What do you mean by that? How many of us have received that comment? What do you mean by that? Versus, you know, in my younger and more vulnerable days, like, have you ever met any other women? You know, maybe I would have, you know, had a sharp kind of whatever, lots of responses. Now, okay, what do you mean by that? Or how do you think that kind of comment lands when you say it? You know, that kind of thing. You can actually, depending on our personalities, that's going to impact how we respond to others. Also, asking that person, can I ask you some questions? And then maybe tapping in to maybe this person has a lot of levels of privilege. And maybe they're part of dominant cultural social identities. Maybe tapping into, can I ask you some questions about what if you didn't have this access to socioeconomics? What if you, you know, and you have ABC, a lot of different scenarios can apply to this example that you gave, where you invite the other person to tap into empathy by presenting another worldview, another way of living, how other people might be experiencing the world, or in this case, Detroit, that this person may or may not have ever even considered. So those are several ways to tap into that. And Amy, I don't know if you have any follow-up. You're welcome to unmute. Okay, thank you. Good.
She says, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? You know, I've found that a lot of the things I mentioned, not just embodying them ourselves, but then folding other people into them as well. And as we get better at them, it becomes more natural for us to learn how. And the research also says, then this is specifically related to faculty. My dissertation work was related to building cultural responsiveness in university faculty. So this is like my big heart issue for me. When faculty demonstrate culturally responsive behaviors in the classroom, they don't even have to have any sort of like DEIB related training. It's just when they model these behaviors, students start modeling them as well in their own lives, which I think is just amazing. And it makes a lot of sense. So as you, as a leader, start demonstrating these behaviors, especially in front of students, they'll start to demonstrate them.
Amazing. Anybody else have any questions?
I had a question come in privately talking about, what do you do when the other person is like closed off emotionally? And how do you remain emotionally open if the other person is not? And oof, that's a hard one. And I would love to hear any of your feedback as well. I always say, give that person their space. Evan mentioned that Enneagram stuff. That's a personality inventory that I use in my personal life and also professionally, not with all groups, but it looks at the motivation behind behaviors, and it really taps in hard to emotional intelligence to integrate. And I know with certain types that I need to give them more time and space, especially if there's something emotional, before I engage them. And it's not because they're necessarily emotionally closed, it's just that the way that they process information is different than I. This also would apply to people with neurodiversity. And so I have to then this is where all of this cultural intelligence comes in. When I'm aware of that person, I can then understand that they're not rejecting me or they're not closed. It just they're responding differently in the world. And then I hopefully have frameworks in place where I can say, hey, let's give it time. Or maybe I can be quiet. I know maybe some of you know about this. There are certain friends that I cannot text them. I have to call them if I want to address something. And there are other friends, don't call, text, leave it over text. Give them time to process before we have a phone call. Same thing in the workplace. Does this need to be an email, or do I need to reach out to have a meeting? Is this like a pop in real quick, or will it just trigger them if I pop into their office? Like you don't always know, and it's going to be different. And again, it sometimes feels like an overwhelming task to do this, but I assure you, is it time consuming? Absolutely. Does it take time to do? Absolutely. But after a while, will you begin to see systemic change? Yes, I have seen it privately, professionally, I should say personally and professionally. And we kind of grow together, and that's truly how you begin to create atmospheres of trust and belonging. I know we're exactly at an hour now because we started at 5 minutes. So I want to pause and give it back to you, Evan, even if you need to wrap up.
I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. We really appreciate you coming. And anybody have any other questions? Going once? Twice?
I see applause.
Okay. Amazing.
Thank you,
Thank
Renee.
you so much.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your meeting, and Evan will be in touch. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
I'll pop off.
Bye-bye.
Have a great week.
Thank you. You too.
All right, Evan, you can stop the recording.
1 second. Go.